Hello, if you're interested in electric vehicles, or if you are thinking about buying or leasing an electric car, or if you already own one like our IONIQ Electric, then you've probably heard of the term range anxiety.
Range anxiety, the fear that a vehicle has insufficient range to reach its destination and would thus strand the vehicle's occupants. The term, which is primarily used in reference to battery electric vehicles, is considered to be one of the major barriers to large-scale adoption of all electric cars. Source Wikipedia.
But I've never found range anxiety to be a particularly useful term in terms of thinking about the capabilities of electric cars and how people actually use them. I think a more appropriate term is comfort zone. Now, this does have aspects of the performance of the electric car you're in, its battery capacity and its kind of nominal range. It also has to do with the way that you think about the kind of risks you're prepared to take and your tolerance for inconvenience. So in this video, we'll think about three things. First, what is the range aspect of range anxiety? What is the range aspect of comfort zone, as I would call it? Second, what are the kind of risk tolerance and tolerance of inconvenience aspects of a comfort zone when driving an EV? And third, is there anything you can actually do to increase your comfort zone in an EV to make it bigger so that you might be able to live with a cheaper but lower range electric car? A typical scenario you might come across about range anxiety would be, somebody wanted to go from here to here and the car or the electric car charging network let them down, and so they got range anxiety. This sort of range anxiety is going to vary so much from person to person, from electric car to electric car, and from trip or use case to trip or use case, and even from country to country. And of course, if at any point you probably think, oh god, just forget about all this, I'm just going to drive the car, and that's what most people do. But these kind of things are going on in the background. First of all, we have the IONIQ, so the range here is, I'm talking about indicated, and we're looking at about 130 miles or about 210 kilometers here. This corresponds obviously to running your battery right down from 100% to 0%. And again, these are indicated battery states of charge. We know that there's some kind of buffer at the bottom of the battery to prevent it from being completely bricked and destroyed. And particularly in the case of the IONIQ, there's a top buffer as well. So what you see as 100% is actually probably 95% of the true state of health of the actual battery. And on the top end, this protection will, in the IONIQ's case, kind of erode over time as the capacity of the battery sort of decreases through the kind of natural wear that we get with temperature, with time, and with number of cycles on lithium-ion batteries. So let's forget about those buffers for the moment, but there's certainly a point in the bottom of the battery near the 0% range where it's basically going to cut off power. Then there's going to be a region where it's going to limit power in different ways. At the top, then, there's going to be a bit where you probably don't want to keep it at 100% to risk you're going to degrade your battery long term. Again, in the IONIQ, when it's new, because of the top buffer, this probably doesn't exist, this orange zone, but in most cars it's kind of there, and you don't want it sitting for long periods, particularly at 100%. Then at the bottom, there's going to be a region where most people are going to kind of start to panic, and the car's going to give you, low state of charge warnings and alerts of various kinds. Then depending on whether you're charging your car every day or once in a while, depending on your usage patterns, there's going to be a period where you're just going to be a little bit uncomfortable about leaving it at high states of charge or going into high states of charge all the time. Now, Tesla vehicles have these defined into the charge limits you can set on charging the battery. So you can have a kind of daily or a trip. So, you can set it to very high if you want to make most use of the battery capacity, or to maintain battery health over time, you can set it to a kind of daily lower figure. You can do this in the new Kona Electric. You can't do it in the IONIQ. Within that, what is your comfort zone actually going to be? To use the whole of this range from 100% to 0%, or it might be different depending on how you're thinking about looking after the car and depending on the kind of trip that you're taking. So if it's a return trip within the range of your battery, there's not much issue here, and you might be prepared to use quite a lot of your battery capacity to do that, because you can charge when you get back home. Similarly, if you're going to somewhere where you have charging at the destination, be that at someone's house or a public charging point of some kind, you might be prepared to use a lot of your available capacity. If you're going somewhere where you don't have guaranteed destination charging at someone's home or public or whatever, you might be a bit more cautious here, because you don't know, how much range you're going to have to leave for yourself to get wherever you need to go next, whether that's back home or some other location. Then if you're doing a much longer trip with multiple charging stops, and some of them might work and some of them might not work, this gets to be a much more complicated process, and also the fact that the battery takes longer to charge when it gets to higher state of charges and increases the time on your journey spent idling while the car is charging, this starts to get a very, very complicated sort of situation altogether, and people's kind of personal preferences here are likely to vary very much in terms of what they'll tolerate, in terms of how long they'll stop, how much they're willing to risk a charger not working en route, and so on. So just complicated. That's the main thing to take away from this. To complicate this even further, in the best conditions on the IONIQ, it can get up to 180 miles, so kind of plus 50 miles, plus 80 kilometers over this nominal 130 mile, 210 kilometer kind of average range. But in the worst conditions, it might get as low as 80 miles range. It will get more if you're going slower, or if it's warmer or flatter terrain you're driving over, and it will get less if you're going faster, if the conditions are cooler, or if you're going, up and down various sort of like hills. So this gives a very complicated picture here, which is a kind of backdrop for why your comfort zone matters more than the kind of range anxiety, because the range anxiety is not a single thing, because, your personal preferences and your personal comfort is going to vary. The car technical parameters are going to vary on all sorts of different conditions around temperature, speed, topography, and so on. What are you prepared to tolerate with this, depending on the type of trip that you're doing? And that's going to really vary from person to person and from situation to situation. Are you alone? Are you with your family? Are you with friends? Are you trying to get to a kind of, a work appointment?
Comfort zone. What is it?
So this brings us then to what is a comfort zone, how would I define it, and how is it likely to vary from person to person. So I'm going to use the example here of myself driving my IONIQ and the well-known YouTuber Bjorn Nyland, who in his Tesla Model X, who does all kinds of, stuff that I probably wouldn't do. Our first factor here is going to be your tolerance for inconvenience, so the kind of convenience factor, and let's give it sort of 3 kind of nominal levels. The other factor is going to be your risk-taking attitude, and again, let's just arbitrarily give it 3 levels as well. So this means we have kind of, let's just say 3 different types of comfort zones here that might apply to different kinds of people. So for instance, if you happen to be well-known electric vehicle YouTuber Bjorn Nyland, driving around typically in his Tesla Model X, on the kind of convenience side of things, you're not worried about the time it takes to stop at different chargers, you're not worried about being inconvenienced by having to find alternative chargers, or being delayed at charging stops, or having to charge on slow chargers, and you're also not worried about getting put on the back of a flatbed truck if you run the car completely to zero, or if you can't find a working charger. You're prepared to be towed and have that kind of very high level of inconvenience that other people won't necessarily tolerate, myself included. You're also prepared to sort of push the technical limits of the car to the point where it might break or require repairs and so on, or even to the point of, damaging it as well. So the kind of risk-taking attitude is very, very high here. So the overall comfort zone would be very large. You've got a lot of scope to work with here. Now, coming to myself, driving my IONIQ. So I've had a Nissan Leaf before, which had a shorter range than our IONIQ Electric, and I've got the IONIQ Electric now, which still doesn't have a kind of, amazingly large range. So I'd put myself at least at a kind of, 1 on the kind of tolerance for inconvenience here, and 1 for kind of risk taking. At the same time, I'm not particularly keen on getting, waiting for long periods at charging areas, and I definitely don't want to get put on the back of a flatbed truck, and I never have. So if you see in my video how low before charging, I've rarely taken electric cars much below 20% state of charge. That's just not something I'm sort of comfortable doing. It's not something I want to do in terms of the inconvenience that might entail if things go wrong, if I arrive at a broken charger or charger already in use, or, inconvenience to my kind of family trips and so on. And this probably means that my risk-taking attitudes are lower than someone like Bjorn Nyland, and that's fine. I can't afford to kind of repair my car or have insurance difficulties or warranty difficulties, so my comfort zone is smaller.
Comfort zone. How to make it bigger.
So this brings us then to my third picture, the final part of this whole topic. Is it possible to actually increase your comfort zone? Is there anything I can do about that? Let's have a look at that quickly in this final picture. I'm going to kind of divide the situation between us, things that I can do, things that we can do as electric car drivers, and a kind of them, which is sort of things that are out of our hands, which we'll come to in a minute. And red, where we are now, not increasing it at all, increasing it a bit, increasing it a bit more, increasing it even more, and then, major changes to it. What would be necessary to actually do that? Now, for my IONIQ, the things I could do to move myself from where I currently am with the size of my comfort zone to make it a bit bigger, I could, for instance, just have more experience driving the car, get to understand, how big that green zone actually is, and where my comfort zone actually fits within that, charge it to 100% more often, run it down to closer to zero more often, get used to the fact of, how it predicts the range in different conditions, and just, open up the envelope of how I'm using the car. And I'm kind of doing that already, actually, in 2019. I could also just get used to traveling around at a lower average speed to make sure that, that the range of the car is automatically higher in all conditions. Or I could sign up to lots of different charging networks to give myself lots of backup plans if things go wrong. I think there's a kind of limit then, as an IONIQ driver, in going any further. What I would need to go into the yellow zone here, I think, is to get something like the Hyundai Kona electric, which has got a 200 plus mile range, 300 kilometer plus mile range. But of course, we're looking at a much bigger cost here. And then of course, with a Kona, you could get to know, you build up your experience and your confidence with it, do the other issues to do with speed and charging networks. That might push you a little bit forward, but there's still a limit there, even with something with as much range as a Kona electric. For me, I think to go beyond that would mean driving a Tesla. So there you've got a much faster, much more reliable, much larger number of actual charger units, supercharger network. And you'd also be spending less time at chargers, if you have to stop, so that the inconvenience level is lower as well. But of course, this entails more cost of actually the sort of entry ticket into the whole Tesla world, which in the UK, as I've said before, is very high. But even then, now we're in the kind of green zone with we own a Tesla and we've got access to the supercharger network. I think there's still another kind of further zone there. The only way to get into the blue zone for me would be to be moving somewhere like Norway, where chargers and superchargers are just kind of ubiquitous. They're everywhere. There's lots of them. And the government has kind of invested very heavily in kind of incentives or waivers for the cost of electric cars, and obviously for supporting the rollout of the charging infrastructure, because it's just, it's world leading in that sense. But for me, as an individual EV driver, as an IONIQ electric driver, there's not a lot I can actually do there. This is out of my hands in a lot of ways. It's either ways to reduce the entry cost into electric cars around incentives and so on, which is, out of my control, or it's ways to kind of support or subsidize or incentivize greater charging infrastructure, which is again out of my hands. So there's a kind of natural limit there that depends on where you live and political situations and so on. So I think in a nutshell there, to wrap up, range anxiety, not a very useful term to me. Too many dimensions to it to be useful. Much better thinking about comfort zone and how that's naturally going to vary from person to person and situation to situation. So it's a very personal thing, and we shouldn't kind of antagonize people about whether they can live with this particular electric car or that particular electric car. A lot of decisions involved there. High element about tolerance to inconvenience, kind of natural differences or behavioral differences in risk-taking attitudes. And then in terms of making the comfort zone bigger, there's a certain amount that we can do as people individually, but then there's bigger issues around kind of institutions and government, I think, that are to some degree out of our hands, and we'll just have to see how these develop in different parts of the world at different paces, really. Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos, and bye for now.